So you think you would really thrive in the Middle Ages, swinging a sword at sunrise, riding through foggy forests, perhaps drinking ale in a smoky tavern like some kind of medieval legend. Honestly, your immune system would surrender in the first hour, your stomach would give up by lunchtime, and your nose would beg for mercy because everything, absolutely everything, smells of decay, sweat, smoke, and centuries of unwashed humanity. That's why most of us wouldn't even survive a single day in the Middle Ages, let alone live. Movies make the Middle Ages look totally cool and dramatic. Knights in shining armor, tables with epic feasts, and people seriously saying, "My liege." But in reality, if one of us were to travel back there, we wouldn't even make it to dinner. Forget dinner. You wouldn't even survive the morning. From spoiled food and terrifying diseases to laws that make no sense at all and a glaring lack of basic hygiene, this era was a real-time survival horror game with no save points. Let's start with the most obvious problem. You would feel dirty within minutes, and I don't mean that I missed my morning shower dirty. I'm talking about layers of grime that people lived with daily and didn't even notice. Bathing was rare in some areas. People only bathed a few times a year. Not because they loved being dirty, but because clean water was hard to come by, and it was believed that bathing too often made you sick. It was thought that water would open the pores and let diseases in, so it was avoided. Public bathhouses existed in medieval cities for a while, especially in parts of Europe influenced by Roman tradition. But eventually they disappeared too, partly due to the spread of diseases and partly because the church was not a fan and associated them with immoral behavior. Even worse, they didn't have soap like ours. They used coarse lye mixtures that irritated the skin, so even if someone cleaned themselves, it wasn't exactly refreshing. Now imagine the streets. There were no sewage systems. Waste from chamber pots was thrown onto the streets. People dumped everything from urine to food scraps right outside their doors. If you walked through the city, you were navigating a minefield of filth. And when it rained, everything mixed into a nightmarish cocktail under your feet, and it wasn't just the streets. Body odor was normal, rotten teeth were normal, lice and fleas were also normal. Everyone had them, even the kings. In fact, nobles often wore fine clothing and powdered wigs to cover up the stench and the critters. Not to be stylish. So if you were catapulted into the Middle Ages right now, the first thing you would notice would be the stench. The second would be the feeling that no matter how often you scrub, you'll never truly be clean again. Not in that world, and this wasn't just unpleasant, it was dangerous. Dirty conditions made infections more likely. Poor hygiene spread diseases rapidly, and without antibiotics or even the concept of germs, people had no idea what was killing them. It's safe to say you'd be truly screwed. But hygiene wasn't the only thing that would be your undoing. If you somehow survived the filth, your next big challenge would be the so-called medicine of the time. But before we talk about that, if the story is gripping you so far, go ahead and leave a like and subscribe to our channel. That helps us bring you more fascinating medieval facts like these. Thank you. As for medicine, you'd probably be better off doing nothing at all than trusting the local doctor. Medieval medicine was, well, a total mess. They knew nothing about bacteria or viruses. The concept of germs was centuries away, so instead of treating the cause of a disease, doctors treated the symptoms in the worst possible way. Let's take cupping or bloodletting. If you had a fever or any infection, the standard treatment was bloodletting. Why? Because it was believed the body consisted of 4 humors: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. And if one of them was unbalanced, you'd get sick, and to fix that, they thought drawing a little blood would bring everything back into balance. This, of course, didn't work and often only made people sicker. You could lose too much blood and die, but that wasn't even the worst of it. If you were lucky, you were treated by your barber. Yes, the guys who cut your hair were also medical professionals, and the tools were not sterilized. Infections from dirty instruments were completely normal and surgeries weren't much better. There was no anesthesia, so amputating a leg or pulling a tooth meant you felt every agonizing second while fully conscious. Painkillers, none to be found. They might give you a quick swig of alcohol, but that was it. Most of the time, you just had to endure it. And infections from open wounds could kill you within days. But it wasn't just the physical treatments that were dangerous. If you had a headache or back pain, you could be treated with bizarre mixtures of herbs and minerals that did more harm than good. If you survived that, you probably had a lot of side effects to deal with afterward. Yes, sometimes they prescribed mercury to treat diseases like syphilis. This is, of course, toxic and would eventually kill you. But at least it looked like they were trying. Or if you managed to survive a medieval illness or injury, it was likely pure luck. And if not, well, at least you didn't have to experience what came next. So now that you've survived a few medieval treatments, it's time to face what you would eat in this nightmare. Well, it's no five-star menu. You know how people complain about not having enough time to cook a good meal. Well, in the Middle Ages, you didn't have the luxury of complaining about anything because you were simply trying to survive until the next meal. Firstly, fresh food wasn't really a thing. Without refrigeration, any meat you ate had to be preserved by salting, smoking, or drying. And these methods, well, they weren't foolproof. If the preservation wasn't done correctly, you quickly had spoiled or rotten meat on your plate. Imagine having to eat that, and if you didn't get food poisoning, it was a miracle. The big problem was contamination. Spoiled food could make you sick within hours, and the worst part was that they had no knowledge of foodborne illnesses. If you ate something spoiled or undercooked, you could die from infections like salmonella or botulism. There were no antibiotics to save you, and let's talk briefly about bread. Bread was a staple for everyone, but it wasn't the fluffy loaf we know today. It was dense, made from grain that wasn't always properly milled, resulting in an unpleasant, gritty texture. In the worst case, it could be full of ergot, a fungus that grows on rye and can cause hallucinations, convulsions, and even death if consumed in large quantities. This was a common problem, and people often only realized they had eaten contaminated bread when the symptoms had already set in. If you belonged to the upper class, you had access to better food, but even they were not immune to risks. Nobles feasted on exotic meats like swan, peacock, or even dormice, but again, without proper preservation or hygiene, even these delicacies could pose a serious health risk. At least they had wine right, but even that wasn't safe. Wine was often diluted with water and sometimes adulterated with dangerous additives. A drink could make you tipsy or kill you. And let's not forget the most essential component of the medieval diet, pottage. This was a thick soup or stew made from whatever people had on hand. It could be made with vegetables, meat, or grains, but the ingredients weren't always fresh and the cooking methods weren't exactly the best. Catching a bad batch of pottage could trigger food poisoning that would make you sick for days. The medieval food system was a gamble. You never knew if you would get something that nourished you or something that would kill you. There was no way to know beforehand except by getting sick. And then it was too late. So now that you've survived a few bad meals, you're probably feeling a bit queasy, and not just because of the food. Let's talk about the next thing, dying from a random disease that's likely just floating in the air or water around you, because in the Middle Ages, your chance of survival was never guaranteed. Even something simple like a cold or the flu could quickly turn serious. Without proper nutrition or medical knowledge, your body couldn't fight things off the way it can today. An infection from a small cut could lead to sepsis and kill you within days. But then came the real killer, the plague. The Black Death wiped out about a third of Europe's population in just a few years. People didn't know what caused it. They blamed bad air, sins, or even foreigners. Meanwhile, rats and fleas spread Yersinia pestis to every corner of the continent. Once you had it, you only had a few days, maybe hours. There were no hospitals, no isolation, and no coordinated medical response. Entire families were wiped out and the dead were stacked in mass graves, and if the plague didn't get you, something else would. Leprosy, tuberculosis, smallpox, all of these were widespread. Even childbirth was dangerous. For women, pregnancy could be a death sentence. There were no clean tools, no antibiotics, and no concept of sterilization. An infection during birth could end everything. Conclusion: if you lived in the Middle Ages, your survival depended not on how strong you were, but simply on whether you were lucky or not. But let's say you survive all that, you've dodged diseases, your body is still working, and you haven't gotten food poisoning. Great. Now all you have to do is try to survive in a world full of violence, lawlessness, and constant conflict. Even if you escaped disease, bad food, and questionable medicine, daily life in the Middle Ages was still constantly threatened by violence. And this didn't always come from invasions or wars. Most often, the danger came from the people living right next to you. Medieval towns and villages had no formal police. Law enforcement was fragmented and often unreliable. If you were robbed, attacked, or worse, there was no one you could call. Local lords might offer some degree of order, but justice was inconsistent. In many areas, communities used the hue and cry system. This meant that if someone committed a crime, the villagers had to pursue them, and if no one did, the criminal got away with it. Punishments were brutal and public. Theft could result in being branded or losing a hand. Serious crimes meant hanging, decapitation, or being locked in the stocks for days. There was no appeal, no proper court process. If someone accused you, especially if they were of higher rank, you had little chance to defend yourself. Guilt was sometimes determined by trials by ordeal, where you had to walk over glowing irons or be submerged in water to prove your innocence. If you survived, you were considered innocent. If you died, well, that was the answer. That's how things went if you were a commoner. The feudal system ensured you stayed at the very bottom. Landowners, knights, and nobles held most of the power. And if they wanted to take something from you, your land, your livestock, or even your family, you had little legal protection. Your survival depended entirely on whether the person above you in the hierarchy felt like playing fair. And now add the constant threat of war. Borders shifted often. If you lived in a region situated between kingdoms or rival princes, your village could be burned down overnight. Soldiers, whether local or foreign, often looted homes and treated civilians as collateral damage. If they needed food, your supplies were taken. If they needed lodging, your home became a barracks. And if they didn't need anything at all, they might still destroy everything simply to make a point. Daily violence wasn't just crime, it was deeply ingrained in the fabric of medieval life. From childhood, people were exposed to cruelty and punishment. It wasn't shocking, it was simply normal. And to survive this, you had to be invisible, obedient, and useful. Anyone who stepped out of line immediately faced the consequences. And even if you did everything right, there was still one final force that could decide everything in your life. Without reason, without warning, nature. So after all the disease, the violence, the famine, you might wonder what daily life for the average person actually looked like. The truth is, it was harsh, monotonous, and centered mostly on survival. If you were a peasant, and most people were, you woke up at sunrise and worked until sunset. There were no weekends, no holidays except for religious festivals, and no free time unless you were sick, which usually only made things worse. You worked your lord's land, gave him a large part of what you produced, and hoped there was enough left to feed your family. You lived in a one-room hut, often with your animals inside to protect them from theft or predators. There was no privacy, no comfort, and hardly any warmth. Your clothes were made of coarse wool. Your shoes, if you had any, were thin and quickly worn out, and you probably owned only a few possessions for your entire life. Education did not exist for most people. If you were lucky, you might learn a few prayers in Latin, but reading, writing, and broader knowledge were reserved for the elite or the clergy. Your world was small. Perhaps just your village and the next one nearby. Travel was dangerous, expensive, and often pointless. Entertainment was rare. Perhaps you heard a traveling bard or saw a festival, but most energy was spent on staying alive. People aged quickly under all the stress. Someone in their 40s looked and felt much older than someone that aged today, and through all of this you were told that this was your place in the world. Religion dominated every part of life. The church dictated how you lived, what you believed, and how you viewed your suffering. People were told that enduring hardship would lead to eternal reward. This hope helped many get through the day, but hope didn't change the conditions. Life in the Middle Ages was not a romantic fantasy. It was brutal, short, and uncertain. Most of us, accustomed to comfort, clean water, modern medicine, and even simply stable food, would not survive 24 hours in that world. But after hearing and seeing all this, what do you think? Could you live in the Middle Ages, or do you prefer the present now? And if you liked the video, please also leave a like and subscribe to the channel. Thank you, farewell. Until the next ride through the Middle Ages.